Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about what being a knight was truly like during the Middle Ages, far from the shining armour and noble quests you may have heard of, and rooted instead in mud, blood, and the harsh demands of loyalty, survival, and war. Close your eyes, if you will, and let your mind drift back with me. Back to a time when the world was simpler, yet far more perilous, when a man's word was his bond, and steel sang its deadly song under the morning sun. But before we begin, tell me, fellow wanderer, from what distant land do you listen, and what time does your clock strike as my account reaches you? It brings me comfort to know when and where my voice is heard. I often smile, though not without sorrow, when I hear men of this age speak of knights as flawless paragons, as if we lived only for honour, love, and glory. They picture us atop gleaming steeds beneath fluttering banners, hearts pure and armour spotless. But they do not smell the sweat beneath the mail, nor feel the chafing blisters after weeks in the saddle. They do not see the bruises from wooden training swords, or the mud that caked our feet in every season but high summer. We were not legends, we were tools, weapons wielded by lords to claim land, crush rivals, or protect borders. Much of my youth was spent not in noble deeds, but standing ankle-deep in filth, guarding some half-forgotten road or shivering beside a drafty wall. Our time was filled with drills, patrols, and waiting, always waiting, for the next command, the next threat, the next raid. And when blood came, it came swiftly, staining our oaths with iron and silence. The troubadours sang of us, yes, but they never walked beside us. They didn't hear the dying breath of a friend gurgling through broken teeth, nor smell the rot of unburied corpses after a failed siege. To be a knight was not to live in a tale, it was to endure. Many of us were poor sons of poorer fathers, trained hard, paid little, and remembered only in tombstones, if remembered at all. You must understand, the idea of the knight has outlived the truth of us. The code of chivalry, so often quoted, was more aspiration than actuality. Some tried to live by it, it is true, but hunger, fear, and the will of powerful men had a way of silencing ideals. I have seen knights burn villages for a lord's grudge, then kneel in prayer an hour later, eyes closed to the screams. Armour rusted faster than virtue, and both were hard to maintain. Most days were tedious, not triumphant. We ate hard bread, mended gear, cleaned horses, and waited in the cold. And when battle came, it was not a glorious clash of heroes. It was noise and panic, sweat and shouting. Your world narrowed to the swing of a blade and the breath in your chest. Many fine knights died with no one to sing of them. Those who wore fine surcoats often had never fought, and those who fought well were often buried with nothing but mud for a shroud. The glory went to the courts, the pain to the field. To speak plainly, our lives were bound to duty, not dreams. And we were taught to silence our doubts beneath the weight of steel and prayer. So when you next hear of a gallant knight rescuing a lady fair, ask instead how many days he rode without food, how many bones ached from wounds that never healed. For behind every myth stands a man, flesh, fatigue, and the quiet ache of truth. I was there, and what I recall is not the shining song, but the silence that followed. My path, like many others, began long before the sword was placed in my hand. At 7 years of age, I was sent away from my mother's arms to serve as a page in a noble household, not to learn honour, but to sweep floors, fetch wine, and keep silent. We were taught obedience before valour, humility before pride. The whip was quicker than praise, and the days were long, filled with menial tasks and aching knees. By 14, I was deemed old enough to become a squire, and the burdens only grew heavier. I bore my knight's armour and weapons, cared for his horse, and stood by during hunts and battles alike. Each morning began before the sun rose, with hours of training in swordplay, riding, wrestling, and more. Bruises became as common as breath. If I faltered, discipline was swift, often cruel, for weakness was seen as failure. We were taught not only to fight, but to serve without question. I still recall sharpening blades by firelight, hands blistered and sore, while my knight feasted in the hall above. And yet I watched him closely, for every gesture was a lesson. How to speak before nobles, how to pray before war, how to hold one's chin even when one's heart shook like a leaf. These things were not written in books. They were earned through pain. Not all squires survived. Infection from a simple wound, a fall from a horse, or a strike during training could end a life before it began. And if you were fortunate enough to endure, you still had to be chosen, called forth and dubbed. There was no guarantee. Some squires remained servants all their lives, forgotten by those they once hoped to become. The sword did not find every hand. The ceremony of knighthood was solemn, yes, but it came only after the scars. I was struck upon the neck by my lord's hand, an ancient rite meant to remind me that pain precedes honour. Then came the sword, the spurs, the vigil at the chapel. I prayed that night in silence, clad in white, asking God for the strength not to fail. But I did not ask for glory. I asked for survival. For knighthood was not the end, but a beginning. With the title came the weight of command, the call to war, the expectation of discipline and sacrifice. I had no land of my own, no wealth, only my sword and the promise of service. I was now a knight, but also a tool of others' ambitions, a blade to be drawn when needed and sheathed when not. Looking back, I wonder how many of us truly understood what we became. The world did not offer rest, it offered challenge. And so we rode, scarred and silent, bearing the burden of a name forged in blood and fire. There was no other way. Not then. Not for us. So, if you think knighthood was a reward, remember this. It was earned with every fall, every bruise, every night spent hungry and forgotten. And even then, it gave little in return but duty. Some wore silk before steel, born to titles and land, their knighthood guaranteed by blood alone. But others, like me, came from humbler soil, sons of minor lords, merchants, or even freed serfs. Through strength, favour, or sheer endurance, we carved our names into the rolls of chivalry. Nobility, you see, was not always inherited. It could be bought, earned, or granted in war, and sometimes it was granted to the unworthy. I recall a man named Etienne, once a brigand along the borderlands, who became a knight after saving a baron's life. He knew little of courtly manners, but he was fearless with a blade and cruel when needed. Some whispered he had murdered children in past raids, yet no one questioned his knighthood once the sword touched his shoulder. His past was buried beneath a surcoat. Such was the weight of favour. Royalty, too, could be swayed by coin or conquest. There were kings who knighted men in droves before campaigns, seeking loyalty more than valour. A purse offered at the right time could turn a merchant's son into a lord's defender. These men might lack the years of squiring, yet bore the same title as those who had bled for it. The line between earned and given grew ever thin. Favoritism ran deep in noble courts. A cousin to a count might be knighted at 16 after a single skirmish, while a hardened veteran was left nameless. And those who questioned it risked more than insult. They risked disgrace, exile, or death. So we kept silent, bowed our heads, and let the young lordlings play at war while we held the shield line. Some knights, especially in times of chaos, acted more as mercenaries than protectors. They fought not for faith or country, but for silver. Their allegiance shifted with the tide of gold, and they bore no shame in it. To them, knighthood was a tool, a way to bargain, to travel, to command. The title was their currency, and battle their market. It pains me to say this, but there were times when nobility meant nothing more than a polished lie. A fine crest, a polished helm, and a seat at the feast did not make one honourable. I have seen knights betray oaths for land, break sieges with bribes, and turn on their own for the promise of a better cloak. The stories do not often speak of them, but I remember. And yet, in that same breath, I must tell you, some of us bore the title with reverence. We rose through hardship, served with integrity, and held fast to what little honor the world allowed. We did not ask for applause. We only asked to be remembered not for the name, but for how we carried it. So when you picture a knight, do not see only velvet and valiance. Remember also the calloused hands beneath the gauntlet, the dirt behind the shine, and the man who rose not from birth, but from fire. Before one earned a sword, one bore the burden of others' blades. As a squire, I rose before dawn to muck stables, polish armor, and run errands that stripped all pride. A knight's boot on your back was not metaphor, it was memory. We were expected to endure, to obey, to remain silent even when blood stained our lips from a harsh blow. Discipline was survival, not kindness. Punishment was handed out as easily as bread, sometimes for faults not our own. I once watched a squire flogged for letting his master's steed stumble, though it was the knight who had drunk too much and lost control. Tears were seen as weakness, bruises as lessons. To become steel, we had to be bent and broken. And many did break, quietly, in the shadows of stone walls. Instruction came not only through sword drills, but through humiliation. We were made to dress knights before the court, scrub their chambers, and stand unmoving in full gear for hours. Mistakes were mocked, failure scorned. Some knights took pleasure in cruelty, testing our endurance not to build us, but to entertain themselves. There were days I hated the very title I sought, yet despite all this, we endured. Perhaps it was pride, or perhaps there was nowhere else to go. I knew lads who whispered of running back to their villages, but none ever did. The path was narrow, but it led to power. To be a knight meant protection, provision, and a place at the Lord's table, if one survived the gauntlet of servitude. There was no guarantee of fairness. Noble sons were praised for little, while common-born squires were expected to prove twice their worth. Some were beaten so often their backs never truly healed. Others were wounded in tournaments, discarded by their masters, and sent home maimed, their dreams shattered. No ballads speak of them, but I remember. What we learned in those years stayed with us longer than any prayer. We learned to bear pain without protest, to nod even when seething inside, to move quickly, and speak only when spoken to. It shaped how we commanded later, how we trusted, or did not trust, those beneath us. Many knights passed that same harshness down, as if cruelty were tradition. Still, some masters taught with dignity. I recall one old knight who never struck us, who led by example and kept his word. His squires served him with pride, not fear. But he was rare, like a flower growing through stone. The rest of us braced ourselves each morning, unsure what fresh test the day would bring. If ever you think the path to knighthood was a golden road, remember the boy behind the shield. Not yet a warrior, not yet free, but already bearing the weight of iron. And pray for him, as I still do, for the one I once was, and the many who never made it through. They call it protection, but to us it was a cage. A full suit of plate felt like a second body, one heavier, hotter, and unforgiving. Once encased, even the simplest task became a struggle. Climbing into the saddle demanded help, and once inside, you prayed not to fall. On foot, every step reminded you how little of your own weight remained under your control. We trained in it daily, yet it never became truly comfortable. The padding beneath soaked with sweat, the joints pinched skin, and in summer, it was like wearing the sun itself. There were times during marches when I thought I might faint within my own breastplate, and if you stumbled in battle, God help you. Rising again was like lifting a tombstone off your back. There were no conveniences inside the shell. If you needed relief, there was no removing it swiftly. One simply endured, or let the body soil itself. The stench stayed with you, clinging to cloth and flesh. And though a night might appear formidable to those watching from afar, inside, we were just men gasping for breath, praying to remain upright. Helmets especially were a trial. Vision narrowed to slits, hearing muffled like underwater. Communication became a matter of shouts and gestures. Many a blow was not seen until it struck. The enemy knew this too, and aimed low, at joints, beneath the arms, at the back of the knees. A knight's armor had gaps, and death crept through them like smoke. It was not uncommon to feel trapped. I once saw a young knight panic, clawing at his visor during a melee as if drowning. He collapsed from heat before the fighting even began. They dragged him out like a statue toppled from a church. No song was ever sung for him, though he had trained like the rest of us. His only mistake was needing air, and still we wore it, because to face war without it was to die quicker. The steel turned many a blade, and there were moments when it saved me. I cannot deny that. But every time I tightened the buckles, I felt a part of myself disappear. Flesh gave way to duty. Breath gave way to silence. Not every knight had the finest armor, of course. Many made do with mismatched pieces, inherited gear, or chainmail patched with scraps. Only the wealthiest had full suits custom forged. The rest of us bore whatever our Lord gave, and we learned to carry its weight or perish beneath it. Pride, for many, was not an option. It was just heavier iron. So when you picture a knight gleaming beneath the sun, remember what lies within. A body aching, a mind focused only on the next step, the next breath. We were not invincible. We were encased. And in that prison of steel, we learned not just how to fight, but how to endure. Cleanliness was a luxury few could afford, and fewer still maintained. We bathed rarely, sometimes once a month, sometimes far less, depending on the season, the campaign, or the whims of our Lord. Water was often scarce, and warm water almost unheard of. Most of us scrubbed only our hands and faces, leaving the rest to fester beneath layers of linen and leather. After a day in armor, the smell could stagger even a horse. Under the padding, our skin would stew in sweat, chafed raw and rubbed by constant motion. Sores formed in places one dared not speak of. I've seen men remove their garments after a week's ride, only to find the fabric fused to their wounds. No ointment could erase the stench of old blood, grease, and human filth. We grew used to it, as one grows used to pain. The worst came in summer. Riding through heat, your body became a furnace, and everything beneath your mail began to rot. The padding grew stiff with salt and grime, attracting lice, fleas, and worse. Our helmets reeked of breath and spit, and once removed, often released clouds of trapped odor. You did not lean close to another knight unless you wished to gag. Soap existed, yes, but it was coarse, rarely used, and reserved for higher-born men or special occasions. I recall scrubbing my hands with ashes more often than with anything scented. And perfumes? Those belonged to nobles at court, not to men who bled in fields. We masked our scent with leather oil or nothing at all. The stink followed us like a shadow. We often rode with open sores and never washed cloaks, our bodies a feast for vermin. I remember waking more than once with bite marks across my legs. At night, it wasn't uncommon to see a man scratching himself raw by firelight. The skin beneath our armor became its own battlefield, and few of us escaped it untouched. And still, we slept close together, shoulder to shoulder in tents or barns, our stench mingling in the thick air. Squires bore the brunt of it, forced to clean our gear and endure our tempers. Some passed out from the fumes when opening a knight's armor after long travel. They joked of burying us with our stink intact, and perhaps they weren't far off. You did not complain about the smell, because to do so was to be mocked. Only corpses are clean, one old knight used to say. And in a way, he was right. Our filth was proof of life, of struggle, survival, and the distance from death. It was the scent of those who had not yet fallen. So if ever you find yourself dreaming of our shining image, let the scent accompany the vision. Behind every polished helm was a man ripe with sweat, grime, and silent suffering. And beneath the romance of the tales lies the truth of our bodies, unwashed, unspoken, and utterly human. From the moment I was knighted, peace became a rarity. Our swords were not for ceremony, they were for blood. We were sent to defend borders, crush rebellions, escort convoys, and seize castles for lords who never lifted a blade themselves. The trumpet's call, the rush of hooves, the clatter of steel, that was our rhythm. War was not an interruption. It was the very reason we existed. There were always skirmishes, if not full battles. One year it was a neighbouring baron refusing tribute, the next a distant duke stirring dissent. Even in so-called peace, there were raids, feuds, and ambushes in the woods. Most conflicts never made it into the annals of history. But we rode to them all the same, spilling blood that no one would remember. The Crusades promised glory, but many knights never made it past the first disease-ridden port. Others died in mud-slicked fields over petty insults or broken agreements. Our lives were consumed by marches, sieges, and sudden violence. We measured years by campaigns, not harvests, and each battle took something, sometimes a comrade, sometimes a part of our soul. Between battles, we trained or waited. Hours spent sharpening blades, checking armor, feeding horses, and reading the faces of the men beside us. Boredom weighed as heavily as fear. A sudden shout at night could send us grasping for our weapons in the dark. We never fully relaxed, not in the hall, not even in prayer. Some men reveled in the fight, their eyes gleaming when steel met steel. But most of us fought because it was expected, because to refuse was to invite shame or death. Oaths bound us, and duty held us upright. And yet, when the arrows flew and the charge began, every man wondered if this would be the day his story ended. We were paid in coin, or land, or favour, if we were paid at all. I've seen knights ride for years before their promised estate ever materialised. Others were rewarded with titles that carried no wealth, only more responsibility. The price of honour was high, and often came without justice. Yet we kept riding forward, dust on our faces and names on our backs. Even when wounded, we returned to the field as soon as we could stand. There were no soft retirements, no long leaves for healing. A bandaged arm still held a sword. A limp could be hidden with the right stirrup. To stay behind was to risk being forgotten or replaced. And so we pressed on, even when every bone cried out for rest. So when you picture us at court, remember that our true place was in the saddle, under the sky, with death just ahead. Not all knights were warriors, but those of us who were carried war in our breath, our scars, and our silence. That was the job. That was the life. They taught us the words early: valor, loyalty, mercy, honor. The code was recited in halls and written in illuminated books, held up as the soul of knighthood. But words alone cannot shape men. In the field, when blood stained your blade and your lord demanded action, mercy was the first thing to vanish. The code, noble as it sounded, was more poetry than practice. I have seen knights strike down prisoners because they were told to make an example. Others trampled fields and torched villages that offered no resistance. And yet, they would kneel in chapel the next day, whispering prayers with hands still sticky from the fight. The code told us to protect the weak, but weakness was often punished, not defended. Ideal and reality rarely walked together. Much of it was meant for the eyes of nobles and the ears of poets. To the people we rode past, the peasants, the widows, the barefoot monks, we were as feared as any bandit. The stories told in court did not match the fear in a child's eyes when a column of mounted men approached. Our banners waved high, but many preferred to hide from them, Some knights did try to live by the code. I knew one who refused to kill a wounded foe, though it cost him his arm in the end. His name was rarely sung, but his choices stayed with me. Yet such men were exceptions, not the rule. The world rarely rewarded restraint. More often, it demanded the opposite. Lords spoke of chivalry in public, then ordered betrayals in private. They used the code as a leash for others, not for themselves. And we, the knights, were expected to obey, to act, and let priests justify it afterward. Many began to see the code as a mask, useful when needed, but discarded in the dark. Women, too, were spoken of in the code. Honor them, defend them, serve them. But in truth, they were used in marriage pacts, traded for land, or taken by force when war allowed it. I have seen noble knights show no more courtesy than a drunken soldier. Courtly love was a verse sung in gardens, not a rule followed on campaign. Still, we kept the code alive in ceremony, in song, in the way we dressed and carried ourselves. Perhaps it was a way to believe we were more than just blades for hire. Perhaps we needed the myth, even if it never matched the mud beneath our feet. The illusion gave structure to the chaos. So when you hear the tales of noble knights who never lied, never faltered, never fell, remember that they were forged by men with ink, not iron. We aspired, yes, but we failed often. The code was a distant star, beautiful to look upon, but too far to reach from the battlefield. After battle, when the cries had faded and the crows began their slow descent, came the part few like to mention. Looting was not shameful, it was expected. We combed the fallen for coin, rings, buckles, and boots. Stripped corpses lay in rows, their belongings divided like grain at harvest. Knights did it, squires did it, even priests turned a blind eye. Sometimes it was quiet work, picking through the dead with careful fingers, searching for hidden purses or fine cloth. Other times, it was chaos, with men fighting over spoils as fiercely as they had moments before against the enemy. I once saw two knights draw blades over a jeweled dagger, their oaths forgotten in the gleam of silver. War stripped us of many things, including dignity. Castles, towns, and villages suffered worse. Once the gates fell, restraint often vanished. Cellars were emptied, stores raided, livestock seized. Women and children fled or hid where they could. We told ourselves it was the price of victory, that plunder kept men loyal and campaigns funded. But deep down, some of us knew better. There were rules, of course, treaties, customs, warnings from bishops and kings. But rules bend easily in the hands of tired, hungry, angry men. After weeks without pay, a knight might see a sack of grain as justice. After watching comrades die, gold from a ransacked manor felt like repayment, and so the lines blurred until no one cared where they were. What troubled me most was how quickly the mind adjusted. At first, I hesitated before taking from the dead. Later, I barely thought at all. I kept trophies, like many did. Belts, rings, bits of cloth. They were tokens of survival, but also reminders of what we had become. When I see them now, I feel more weight than pride. In distant courts, they called it spoils of war. But for the villagers, it was ruin. I remember one old woman clutching her last goat, sobbing while we rode past with our bags full. Her face returns to me more often than the faces of those I slew in battle. There was no honor in hunger or loss. And yet, it was woven into the rhythm of war. Lords expected a share. Ransoms were negotiated with practiced hands. Even holy orders participated, claiming relics and coin under the banner of righteousness. To loot was not to fall from grace. It was to take what victory allowed. So if you seek stories of pure-hearted warriors who fought only for justice, look elsewhere. We fought for coin, for land, for titles, and when the fight ended, we took what was left. That too was knighthood. That too must be remembered. They called them games, but they were anything but gentle. The tournament field was no place for jesters or courtiers. It was a battlefield wearing a smile. Beneath the banners and trumpets, real bones broke, real blood spilled. I entered my first melee with hope and left with 3 cracked ribs and a tooth gone. Victory brought gold, yes, but defeat could bring a grave. Jousts were the crown of such events, 2 men thundering at each other with lowered lances, wood splintering like lightning. From the stands, it looked glorious. From the saddle, it was chaos. A poor strike meant a shattered shoulder or a pierced throat, even with armor. I saw a knight impaled clean through his visor once, dead before he touched the ground. The melee, a brutal mock war, was worse still. Dozens of knights clashing in a storm of steel, alliances shifting mid-fight, men dragged off their horses and beaten senseless. There were rules, yes, but few followed them once the dust rose. Some fought with dulled weapons, others hid sharp ones beneath false edges. Winning meant reputation, and reputation meant advancement, so anything was permitted. Injuries were common, and many who joined for glory left limping for life. Arms were dislocated, jaws broken, eyes lost. And yet we returned again and again. Why? Because in times of peace, a knight needed to prove himself. Tournaments were the stage on which a man could rise or fall forever into obscurity. Spectacle drew the crowds, and the lords wagered heavily. We were entertainment as much as warriors, paraded before nobles who cheered at our pain. The prizes were generous: gold, horses, even land, but only for the best. For the rest, there was bruised pride, unpaid debts, and scars. Yet still, we smiled, as the crowd demanded blood disguised as sport. Not all who entered were equal. Wealthier knights had better armor, trained squires, and fresh horses. The poorer among us borrowed gear, rode tired mounts, and fought desperate for recognition. I knew a young knight who died in his first tilt, his borrowed helm split like ripe fruit. His name was forgotten before the tents were folded. There were moments of honor, yes, a handshake after the tilt, a salute to a fallen foe. But they were rare and fleeting. Most came to win and would stop at nothing. And once the feast began, all wounds were forgotten in drink and laughter. Until the next day, when another helmet was fastened and another lance couched. So if you imagine tournaments as courtly games, remember the broken fingers, the crushed lungs, the silent prayers whispered before riding out. We fought as if it were war, because for us, it was. Only the music changed, the danger remained. Faith, we were told, was our compass, guiding hand, shield of the soul. But in the hands of those with power, it often became a blade. Priests blessed our swords before slaughter, calling upon heaven as we rode to shed blood. We were taught that to kill for the church was not a sin, but a holy act. Thus did sacred words become the whisper behind many crimes. I remember kneeling in a chapel before a campaign, a priest declaring us soldiers of God. We had been ordered to raid a village that refused to pay taxes, yet we marched out as if angels flew beside us. The cross hung from my neck, but doubt crept in with every step. Still, we went, and the banners of faith fluttered above fire and screams. In the Crusades, faith was both cause and cover. Men who had never set foot in a church claimed divine purpose as they looted and killed. Relics were paraded like trophies. Sermons preached of salvation through conquest. I saw one bishop give absolution to a knight moments before he burned a house with a family still inside. God wills it, they said. I heard that phrase more often than truth. Confession became routine, a way to cleanse the hands without changing the heart. I myself once knelt after a campaign, listing sins that still wake me in the night. The priest gave his blessing, told me to fast and recite the Psalms. I left the chapel feeling no lighter. The burden remained, because not all wounds are visible, and not all guilt is washed away. Not all clergy were blind. Some dared to rebuke us, to speak of mercy and restraint, but many were bound to the same lords we served, Their silence was often purchased, their sermons tailored to suit the sword. Monasteries gave coin to armies, and bishops crowned kings. The line between heaven and throne blurred until it vanished. We were told that pagans, heretics, and even rival Christians were enemies of the faith. That made it easier to strike them down. I've watched knights ride into cities under the cross, then emerge with blood up to their knees. To them, salvation was a campaign away, and doubt was a sin to be crushed with certainty. Even relics were used to control us. A splinter from the true cross, a saint's bone. These were marched before armies as if they could sway fate. I saw men weep before a gilded skull, then commit acts they would never speak of again. We believed because we were taught to believe, and we killed because it was wrapped in prayer. So know this: faith was not absent in our world. It was everywhere. But its light was often dimmed by ambition, twisted by fear, and used as a tool to turn good men into weapons. Not all who rode beneath the cross rode with pure hearts, and not all who died beneath it deserved their fate. When the call came from Rome, many of us answered not with joy, but with grim resolve. We were told it was a holy journey, a sacred duty to reclaim Jerusalem. But what awaited us was not glory. It was starvation, disease, and endless death. I rode alongside knights who dreamed of paradise and died in filth before ever seeing a Saracen. The heat alone was enough to break a man's spirit. The journey stretched across foreign lands, where language, food, and mercy were all strangers. We begged in cities that feared us, fought in deserts that swallowed horses whole. The crusader camps stank of rot, bodies unburied, flies thick as smoke. We drank brackish water, chewed mouldy bread, and slept with knives drawn. Fever claimed more than arrows ever did. I watched men abandon armor just to survive the march. Others grew savage, looting fellow pilgrims for food. One winter, we boiled leather for broth. Another, we traded relics for firewood. Hunger stripped away chivalry faster than any blade. Some nights turned to prayer, others to madness. The road to the Holy Land was paved with broken oaths. When battles came, they were not the noble contests sung in Europe. They were frenzied, blood-soaked nightmares. Screams echoed through the dust as limbs were hacked, horses gutted, and cities set ablaze. At Antioch, we starved and then butchered with fury. At Jerusalem, we wept in victory, not for joy, but for what we had become. The streets ran red for days. We were told we brought light to the east, but we carried fire. Mosques were torched, libraries pillaged, families slaughtered. It mattered little whether the man before you believed differently. If he stood in the way, he died. And for each village taken, a dozen more resisted, their cries lost beneath the roar of our advance. Not all knights rejoiced in the carnage. Some recoiled, others wept in secret. I met one who threw down his sword after seeing a child crushed beneath a siege tower. He vanished into the wilderness. We called him a coward, but now I wonder if he was the only one who truly saw. In the mirror of that war, few of us recognized ourselves. The rewards were sparse. Land was promised and rarely given. Gold was seized and lost to thieves or taxes. Many knights returned with little but disease and scars. Others never returned at all, buried in foreign soil or left to rot unmarked. The songs back home sang of triumph. We knew only silence. So if you think the Crusades were a march of righteousness, think again. For us, it was not a pilgrimage. It was a descent. Into blood, into hunger, into a fire that no cross could extinguish. We rode for God, they said, but in truth, we rode through hell. Peace unsettled some of us more than war ever did. When the drums fell silent and the fields grew still, a strange emptiness took hold. We were trained to fight, shaped by conflict, rewarded in blood. Without battle, some nights wandered like ghosts, restless and cold, seeking quarrels where none were offered. I have seen strong men tremble, not in fear, but in stillness. The rhythm of war becomes a part of the body, the weight of armor, the smell of sweat, the thunder of hooves. When it vanished, we felt hollow. Many sought out tournaments, feuds, or distant skirmishes simply to feel alive again. They said it was duty, but I saw the hunger in their eyes. The battlefield had become their only sanctuary. I once rode with a knight who smiled only when blades were drawn. He laughed in the charge and wept during peace. In winter, he picked fights with drunkards just to bleed. He had known war since boyhood and could not bear the quiet of his own thoughts. He died in a tavern brawl, grinning through broken teeth. No prayer could reach him by then. Some took to mercenary work, roaming from one war to another. They sold their swords to any who paid, loyal not to cause, but to combat. The fight was all they knew, all they trusted. Kings used them like hounds, loyal when fed, deadly when loosed. And like hounds, many died forgotten in foreign lands, buried in shallow graves. Others turned brutal at home, ruling their lands with iron fists, provoking duels, punishing servants for imagined slights. They could not lay down the sword, even when there was no enemy to face. Their wives feared them, their children hid. Without war to contain their fury, they became storms within stone walls. Peace, to them, was a cage. Priests spoke of redemption, of laying down arms and seeking salvation. But not all hearts could be healed. Some knights confessed weakly, hoping to wash away the need that never left. Yet every rusted blade, every old scar called them back. They were not evil, just lost, shaped by a world that taught them to kill and never how to stop. I have known this pull myself. In moments of quiet, I have felt my hand twitch for a sword no longer there. The silence grows loud and memories come unbidden. Shouts, hooves, the wet thud of steel on bone. We were praised for our strength in war, but no one taught us how to be gentle when the banners fell. So understand, not every knight longed for peace. Some needed war like breath, not for glory, but because it made sense. In a world of shifting loyalties and quiet shame, violence was the only language we truly understood. And once it entered the soul, it seldom left. We had no words for what haunted us, but we carried it just the same. Nightmares came often, visions of blood, screams, the final gaze of a dying man. Some nights awoke shouting, soaked in sweat, clutching for a sword that wasn't there. Others sat silently by the fire, eyes fixed on nothing, lost in memories too heavy to speak aloud. The wounds inside us bled longer than those on the flesh. Some drank to silence the past. Ale, mead, anything that dulled the edge of memory. I knew a man who could not sleep unless drunk, for sober dreams brought back the siege of Béziers in all its horror. He forgot names, but not faces. The children, the burning, the cries. The bottle became his only refuge, until it became his coffin. Others grew cold and distant, avoiding laughter, shrinking from touch. I saw one knight flinch when a child ran to him with open arms. He had seen too much, done too much. The mind, when burdened past its limit, begins to close itself. And in doing so, it closes to joy, to tenderness, to light. That was the cost many paid in silence. Some grew angry without cause, rage flashing at a word, a sound, a shadow. They lashed out at servants, family, friends. It was not cruelty, but confusion. Their souls remained on the battlefield, waiting for an ambush, a blade, an order. Even in the calm of a banquet hall, they heard the clash of war echoing behind every voice. Many knights never spoke of these things. We were taught to be stoic, to endure. To cry was shameful, to admit fear unmanly. So we buried it deep, behind nods and armor and prayer. But buried wounds fester, and over time, that silence became a sickness of its own, a slow, hollowing ache that never left. The church offered confession, But sin was not the root of our suffering. We sought peace through penance. But how do you atone for surviving? For returning home when others didn't? The guilt weighed heavier than any sword. I have seen grown men weep alone, whispering apologies to ghosts who would never answer. Some withdrew entirely, retreating to monasteries, forests, or distant shores. They left their spurs behind, hoping solitude might bring healing. A few found it. Most did not. Because the war was no longer out there. It had taken root within. And no wall, no prayer, no silence could hold it back forever. So when you hear of noble knights returning from war, do not imagine parades and celebration. Imagine a man staring at his hands, wondering if they will ever feel clean. Imagine a heart that no longer trusts peace. We bled outward, yes, but we also bled within, and no armor could protect us from that. We were told we were defenders of the faith, protectors of Christendom. But the truth was more tangled than any banner. I have raised my sword against men who knelt before the same altars, who spoke the same prayers, who wore the same cross upon their chest. Borders and pride made enemies of brothers, and the church, though troubled by it, rarely stopped us. Feudal loyalties meant more than shared belief. If a French duke feuded with an English earl, we fought, not for heresy, but for honor, for land, for who held the stronger claim. I remember a siege in Flanders, the chapel shattered by our own catapults, the choir boys fleeing in terror. The men we slew inside had rosaries around their necks. Still, we called it victory. Civil wars bled across kingdoms. In England, the houses of York and Lancaster tore each other apart, both claiming divine right. In Italy, city-states like Florence and Siena clashed, each one Catholic, each one righteous in its own eyes. God was on everyone's side, or so it was said. And yet he remained silent as we struck down our kin. Some of us questioned it. How could we be holy men with blood of fellow Christians on our blades? But questioning brought suspicion. Loyalty was to your Lord first, to your church second, and to your conscience last, if at all. And so we buried our doubts, just as we buried those we had killed, deep and with no name. I recall one Easter morning, a truce broken before the bells had finished ringing. We stormed a town still hanging palm branches from their doors. The priest begged us to wait, but the command had been given. We cut down men still wearing their Sunday best. I've never forgotten the look in the priest's eyes. Betrayal, not fear. The church sometimes intervened, declaring truces on holy days, urging peace during Lent. But lords ignored such calls when profit was near, and knights, bound by oath and coin, followed. The Pope might excommunicate one army, only to bless another weeks later. Faith bent with the wind, and the wind favoured steel. Even in the Crusades, Christian armies fought each other. Disputes over leadership, loot, or pride erupted into bloodshed. I saw a band of Germans clash with French crusaders outside Acre, brothers in creed, but not in cause. The Holy Land became a chessboard, and we, the pieces, each side convinced it held the truth, each side willing to kill to prove it. So when you hear that knights defended Christendom, know that the truth is greyer than the songs suggest. We did not always fight the unbeliever. Often we turned our blades on those just like us. And in those moments, the cross we bore felt heavier than any sword. From afar, they looked majestic, stone towers piercing the sky, walls thick and proud. But inside, life was cold, hard, and often bitter. The great halls echoed with draughts that no hearth could chase away. We slept in cloaks on wooden boards, sometimes with armor still strapped on, more out of caution than comfort. Luxury was rare, and warmth rarer still. In winter, frost formed on the inside of our windows, when windows there were. Wind howled through arrow slits, and the smell of damp never left the stones. Rats nested in the corners, and lice shared our beds without invitation. Fires smoked more than they warmed, and smoke clung to everything: cloaks, beards, breath. At times, it was warmer outside than in. Bathing was infrequent. Water had to be hauled from wells or streams, heated in iron pots, and poured into wooden tubs that cracked in the cold. I once waited 3 weeks for a bath during a siege, and when the water finally arrived, it was shared with 2 other knights. The scent lingered longer than the relief. Food was coarse: black bread, salted meat, thin pottage. When supplies ran low, meals became silent, desperate affairs. The kitchens were smoky dens, filled with shouting, grease, and sweat. Meat hung from beams, but most of it was tough, or worse, rotting. A knight might have titles, but at the table, he often chewed like a peasant. The latrines were little more than stone chutes hanging over the walls. In summer, they reeked beyond measure. In winter, they froze. You learned to go quickly and to hold your breath. Disease spread easily within these walls: fevers, flux, pox, and once it started, few rooms were safe from its reach. Servants fared worse, packed into the lowest rooms or attics, often sleeping beside animals for warmth. Squires lived in constant motion, carrying hot stones or tending the fire through the night. Their hands cracked from the cold, their eyes red with smoke. I pitied them, for I had once stood in their place, shivering, aching, silent. Even the lord's chambers, dressed in tapestries and trimmed with furs, could not escape the cold. I once dined with a count who wore 3 layers of wool beneath his velvet, teeth chattering between bites. Candles barely pierced the gloom, and always, beneath it all, the smell of wet stone and old ash. So do not be fooled by the grandeur of battlements or the poetry of towers. Within those walls lived hunger, chill, and fatigue. Castles were strongholds, not sanctuaries, and for those of us who called them home, comfort was something imagined, not felt. We spoke vows at the altar, but the match was often made long before. Marriages were not born of affection. They were forged in parchment, sealed with wax, and weighed in land and silver. A knight might ride for honour, but he wed for politics. Fathers bartered daughters like coin, and lords promised brides as rewards. I accepted my wife not from love, but from duty. I first saw her on our wedding day, her face pale beneath a silk veil. She was quiet, obedient, trained, not cherished. Our union joined 2 small holdings, a strategic bridge between baronies. We spoke more of borders than of dreams. She bore me children and kept my hearth, but there was always a distance, a silence neither of us knew how to cross. Some knights fared better, marrying women they respected, even grew to love. But many lived beside strangers, bonded by title rather than tenderness. I knew a man who referred to his wife only as the dowry. He treated her kindly, but never once called her by name. Romance, when it existed, bloomed elsewhere, in secret gardens, not within stone walls. Affairs were common, though rarely spoken of aloud. A knight might keep a mistress, a lady her poet or priest. Some were discreet, others reckless. Jealousy festered in some halls, igniting feuds, duels, and whispers. But the church taught endurance, and so many remained married in body, though their hearts had long since wandered. Women had little say in the match. Their consent, when asked, was ceremony. I watched girls barely past childhood wed to men twice their age. Their eyes held sorrow, not joy, and yet they smiled for the feast, bowed before lords, and disappeared into chambers prepared by strangers. Such was the way of things. For widows, marriage became a tool again. A woman with land was valuable, but only if claimed by another man. I've seen knights wed grieving women at graveside, the body barely cold. Love waited for no one when property was at stake. And if she refused? There were ways to persuade, or to take by right of conquest. Some, of course, resisted the custom. I knew a lady who fled to a convent to escape her second marriage. The church sheltered her, though her family branded her a traitor. I visited her once in old age. She was peaceful, more than most. I never wanted a husband, she said. Only a quiet place to breathe. That stayed with me. So understand, the wedding did not mark the beginning of joy. It marked an agreement. A pact between houses, sealed by two people who often barely knew each other. We bore it because we were told it was noble. But beneath the oaths and the veils, many of us wondered what might have been, had love been allowed a voice. They sang of ladies in towers and knights who pledged undying love. But such songs rarely matched the world we knew. Most women were not adored. They were controlled, silenced, and used to serve ambition. Their worth was measured in dowries, their voices dismissed in councils, their bodies owned in marriage. A woman's place, they said, was beside her husband, but only when summoned. And even then, she was to walk behind. I watched noble women rule estates in their husband's absence, showing wisdom and strength. Yet when he returned, her authority vanished like morning mist. She became again the quiet shadow at the feast. Her name was rarely recorded unless tied to scandal or childbirth. Even those who led with grace were remembered only as wives, mothers, or widows, never simply as themselves. Peasant women fared no better. They worked from dawn to dusk, field, fire, and family resting on their shoulders, and still they were subject to their husbands' tempers, the Lord's taxes, and the priest's judgment. A bruised face brought no justice, only silence. Their pain was common, and because it was common, it was ignored. The courtly love sung by troubadours painted women as divine muses, pure and untouchable. But that ideal was fantasy, whispered in gardens and written in verse, not lived in households. Real women bled, wept, and endured in the margins of power. I've seen knights praise their lady love in one breath, then curse their wives in the next. Some women wielded influence, queens, abbesses, noble widows, but always through narrow channels. They had to be clever, careful, and quiet, working behind the curtain of a man's name. A misstep could cost them everything. Even a rumor could send them to a convent, or worse. Power was permitted, not granted, and it came at a high cost. Rape in war was common, and often excused as spoil. I cannot forget the screams I heard in plundered villages. We told ourselves it was part of the storm, part of conquest, but that was a lie we used to sleep at night. The women had no voice, no recourse, no justice. Their suffering was swallowed by the silence of our victory. Not all men were cruel, not all women powerless. There were knights who defended the weak, and women who defied the chains laid upon them. I knew a lady who taught herself to read the Latin texts her priest forbade. She copied psalms in secret, her hands trembling with purpose. She died unknown, but to me, she was a queen. So let no tale deceive you into thinking women were cherished ornaments in our world. They were survivors, resilient, clever, and enduring more than most men will ever know. If there was any nobility in our time, I found more of it in the kitchens and birthing rooms than in the halls of power, and I have never forgotten that. Not every man who bore the title of knight was worthy of it. There were those among us who hid cruelty behind polished armor, who took what they wished not by right, but by force. The title gave protection. Once knighted, a man could do great harm before anyone dared stop him. Lords shielded their favorites, and the church was often slow to condemn. And so, some wore the cross with blood still fresh on their hands. I knew one such man, a knight feared more for his temper than his sword. He extorted villages under the guise of protection, beating peasants who could not pay. His squire once wept to me in secret, arms bruised, voice shaking. Yet the knight dined beside counts and kissed relics in chapel. His violence was known, but he fought well, and that bought silence. Bands of rogue knights wandered the countryside between wars, offering their blades to the highest bidder, or simply taking what they wanted. They burned farms, kidnapped for ransom, and held roads for tolls. Some called them hedge knights, others free lances. But there was little freedom in their path, only hunger and the rusted scent of fear left in their wake. Even in courts, corruption festered. Bribes bought titles, favors masked transgressions. A knight who pleased the right lord could escape punishment again and again. Trials were rare, and even when held, justice often favored the noble-born. A peasant's word weighed little against a coat of arms. Many crimes were never punished, only passed down in whispers. Crusades gave cover to many such men. Under the banner of faith, atrocities were committed that no code could excuse. Looting, murder, assault, all wrapped in prayer and blessed by bishops eager for victory. The road to Jerusalem was paved not only with devotion, but with cruelty dressed in armor, and few dared question it. Those who tried to speak out, monks, scribes, even fellow knights, were often silenced or ignored. "He is a knight," they would say, as though that excused all things. And perhaps, in that world, it did. For every man who upheld honor, another tarnished it. But the songs rarely sang of the latter. Yet not all knights turned blind eyes. Some challenged their corrupt brethren, even at great risk. I witnessed a duel where a younger knight struck down his own cousin to defend a village's honor. He was exiled for it, stripped of land, but he walked away with his soul intact. Not all were lost to the rot, so do not imagine knighthood as a guarantee of virtue. The sword cuts both ways, and the hand that wields it is not always just. Behind the banners and titles stood men, flawed, fallen, sometimes foul, and in truth, the armor hid as much as it protected. Sometimes it hid the worst of all. We swore oaths with solemn voices, hands upon relics, eyes lifted to heaven. But when gold clinked or land was promised, many forgot the words they once spoke. Allegiance was a coin easily turned. I have seen knights trade lords like horses, shifting banners with each new promise. Loyalty was praised, but rarely practiced when profit knocked. A powerful lord could summon 100 knights, not all from loyalty, but from fear or greed. They came for spoils, titles, or the chance to rise. And if his power waned, so did their loyalty. Men who once knelt in devotion would ride against him without hesitation. I watched it happen more than once. It always began with whispers. During civil strife, these shifts were common. A knight might fight for one side, then defect mid-battle. Lords offered pardons and lands to those who changed allegiance. It became a strategy, not only to win wars, but to weaken enemies from within. Betrayal was not always punished. It was often rewarded. Some rationalized their choices, saying a knight served justice, not men. Others claimed the new lord was more righteous or more generous. But most simply followed where power flowed. Loyalty became less about honor and more about survival. And for those without inheritance, the shifting winds were sometimes the only path forward. I once knew a knight who changed sides 4 times in a single campaign. Each time, he arrived bearing flattery and promises. Each time, he was welcomed, until the last. When his usefulness waned, he was found in a ditch, throat cut. No one claimed his body. Even betrayal, it seemed, had a limit. Honor was still spoken of course, at feasts, in vows, before the charge. But in the corridors of power, it was just another mask. I remember a lord who toasted loyalty each night, then sent letters by secret hand to rival courts. We guarded him with our lives, not knowing his eyes had already turned. Not every knight followed this path. Some held firm, even when offers poured in. They paid dearly, loss of land, exile, or death. But they slept with clearer minds. I envied them, even as I held my post beside more calculating men. To stay loyal was not easy. It was costly, often fatal. So know this, loyalty in our time was not a shining chain. It was a thread, frayed and pulled by many hands. Knights did not always serve truth. They served what kept them fed, armed, and remembered, and the banner above their heads, that could change as quickly as the wind. We rode with steel on our backs and prayers on our lips, but neither could hold death at bay for long. It waited in ambushes, in fevers, in the careless slip of a blade. I buried more comrades than I can name, some in shallow graves by the roadside, others left where they fell. There was no ceremony, no hymns, just silence and the smell of blood. Battle took many, but peace claimed its share. A cracked rib from a fool could fester and kill within days. A scratch could turn septic. Wounds healed poorly without clean water or knowledge. I watched strong men die from simple infections, their bodies convulsing while we stood helpless. Death was not dramatic. It was slow, ugly, and frequent. Even at rest, we slept with swords within reach. No door was ever fully trusted, no wall too thick to breach. I once awoke to the sound of steel, a fellow knight slain in his tent over a gambling debt. He had survived 2 campaigns but could not survive a friend's anger. Death, we learned, had no rhythm, only presence. Poison was a fear in courtly circles, a hidden killer beneath gilded plates. I knew a noble knight who fell dead mid-feast, goblet still in hand. His wine had been laced, they said, though no one was punished. Death moved easily through castles as it did on the battlefield. It wore many cloaks: blade, illness, betrayal. The roads were no safer. Bandits lurked in woods, waiting for lone riders. Some were former soldiers, hardened by war, now turned to desperation. They knew where to strike, what to take, and how to vanish. I've seen the aftermath of such ambushes. Riders stripped, throats open, their eyes wide beneath broken helms. Even hunting carried risk. A thrown spear, a startled horse, a boar's tusk. Death did not care for nobility. I once saw a knight bleed out from a simple fall, his head split upon a tree root. We carried death in our saddlebags, though we tried not to speak of it. To dwell on it was to invite it closer. And still, we lived as if tomorrow would come. We trained, we laughed, we drank under stars that watched countless men die before us. Perhaps it was denial, or perhaps defiance. But each day we mounted, we knew it could be the last. And we rode anyway, because fear could not be allowed to lead. So when you hear tales of heroic death, understand how fragile we truly were. Death did not wait for valor. It came without warning. For knights, life was a borrowed flame, flickering in the wind. And we guarded it, not with arrogance, but with the quiet, constant knowledge that it could be snuffed at any time. When the plague came, it did not ride on horseback or shout warnings from the hills. It crept in silence, invisible and merciless. One day, the market bustled. The next, it was still, save for the moans behind boarded doors. I saw towns emptied in a week, livestock wandering without masters. No sword could fend it off. It claimed peasants and nobles alike. Knights, once seen as protectors, became powerless. Our armor meant nothing. Our titles could not bribe death. Some fled their posts, abandoning keeps and charges alike. Others locked themselves in towers, praying the stone would hold against breath and shadow. But the plague slipped through cracks no wall could stop. I carried the body of a fellow knight to a ditch, his lips blackened, his limbs stiff. No priest came to bless him. The churches were full, of the dead, not the devout. Bells rang constantly, until no one remained to ring them. Cities became graveyards. Villages vanished. Even the crows grew fat and slow. With death everywhere, fear grew wild. People whispered of divine punishment, of witches, of poisoned wells. Some turned on neighbors, some on themselves. Flagellants marched through towns, bleeding and chanting, hoping pain might drive the sickness away. But the air remained thick with rot, and the plague did not answer prayers. The feudal order cracked. Lords died, heirs vanished, and with them went the thin thread of command. Serfs fled lands once held tight. The fields lay fallow, and hunger joined the dance of death. Labor became rare, and suddenly those who survived found power shifting. A peasant who once bowed might now bargain. Knights who lived through it returned to changed realms. Their services less needed, their power less feared. The disease had humbled more than armies ever could. We were not gods in armor. We were flesh, breakable and afraid. The old rules no longer held firm. The world had shifted, and we with it. Some turned to the church with desperate faith. Others turned away in bitter silence. I did both, depending on the day. I rode through lands once ruled by law and found only echoes and ash. The roads were quieter, but not in peace, only absence. It was not the end of knighthood, but it marked its decline. So if you wonder what truly shook the age of chivalry, do not look first to war or politics. Look to the silent killer that passed through our windows at night, that taught us how little our banners meant. The Black Plague stripped away illusion, and what remained was not glory, but survival. We trained to be strong, but strength could not outpace the grave. Few of us lived to see grey hair. Most died in battle, on campaign, or from wounds that never healed. Others fell to sickness, accidents, or the quiet hunger that came in lean winters. The armor we wore slowed arrows, but it could not shield us from time. From the moment we were squired, we knew our lives would be short. The pages whispered it in the stables, and the veterans bore it in their eyes. We fought as though each ride could be the last, and often it was. I've buried friends before they turned 25, their names carved into wood, their memory carried in silence. War was constant, and even small skirmishes could turn fatal. A single arrow through the thigh could fester into death. A glancing blow to the head might take days to claim its victim. There were no surgeons as you know them now, only herbs, cautery, and prayers, and none could promise survival. We rode with death beside us, always. Even training killed. A misstep in a joust, a fall from a startled horse, a blade that slipped during practice. I watched a young knight bleed out in the yard from a cracked helm. His mother arrived 2 days later to see the blood still staining the straw. She screamed once, then never spoke again. Winter brought sickness, lung rot, fevers, wasting. We huddled by fires, but still, men coughed themselves to death before spring. Infection ran rampant in camps and keeps. A bad wound, an unwashed hand, a dirty blade, all could be fatal. Our world was sharp, but death was sharper. It came quietly, often without warning. Some nights were simply worn down. Years in the saddle, repeated injuries, blows that never truly healed. They limped, groaned, and bled in private until their bodies gave out. I knew one who died in his sleep, bones twisted from old wounds. He was only 30, but looked twice that. War aged us long before our time. And for those who did survive longer, there was no rest. The threats never ceased. Rebellions, raids, duels. Even a feast could turn fatal with the wrong word or the wrong cup. Peace was fleeting. We learned to savor it like rare wine, knowing it would not last. Each breath was borrowed. So when you see a statue of a knight, consider how rare that old face truly was. Most of us died young, with steel in hand and unfinished prayers on our lips. We did not expect long lives, only lives remembered. And even that, for many, was too much to hope. Though we were sworn to defend the faith, not all knights bowed to the altar with pure hearts. Some grew too powerful, too unruly, answering to steel rather than scripture. They plundered monasteries, challenged bishops, and defied papal commands when it suited them. The church, mighty as it was, began to tremble before certain swords, for not all who rode beneath the cross rode in its service. I recall one knight, draped in black, who seized church lands after a local priest refused to bless his campaign. He burned the chapel to its bones and dared any cleric to stop him. No punishment followed, only murmurs and fear. His men were loyal, his coin abundant, and the bishop simply disappeared. Such men carved their own law. In regions where royal authority was weak, knights ruled like petty kings. They taxed the clergy, disrupted processions, even struck down friars who spoke against them. The church tried to excommunicate some, but when no army came to enforce the decree, the sentence rang hollow. A knight feared no parchment, only blade and blood. And if the sword was his alone, he answered to no one. There were whispers of heresies too, knights who dabbled in forbidden texts, who mocked relics and turned away from the sacraments. Some joined secret brotherhoods, gathering at night to speak of truths the church condemned. They sought power not through prayer, but through knowledge. To the clergy, such defiance was as dangerous as any invading army. In times of rebellion, many such knights rose to prominence, leading revolts against ecclesiastical lords. They saw the wealth of abbeys and cathedrals and questioned why holy men lived better than soldiers. I rode past one monastery razed to ash, the gold plate stolen, the monks scattered. God watches from afar, the rebel knight had said, but we live here. The church responded with bulls, councils, and denunciations. Some knights were hunted, named heretics, their lands seized when possible, but others were too entrenched, too beloved, or too feared. They wore piety like a cloak when it suited them, and cast it off just as quickly. The chalice and the sword wrestled for power, and not always with clear victor. Still, not all knights defied the church out of malice. Some saw corruption within its walls and sought justice by other means. They demanded reforms, exposed abuses, protected those the clergy ignored. Their rebellion was not against God, but against those who used his name for gain. Yet even righteous defiance was branded as sin. So know this, the church held immense power, but it was not absolute. Some knights stood outside its shadow, dangerous, defiant, unpredictable, and in that space between altar and sword, fear took root on both sides. For when belief meets unchecked force, even holy ground may tremble. They were once the most revered order in Christendom, warriors of the cross, protectors of pilgrims, guardians of Jerusalem. The Knights Templar stood apart from us, bound not to a lord, but to God himself, or so it seemed. I saw them ride through towns with heads held high, coffers full, and churches blessing their steps. But power breeds envy, and wealth draws eyes sharper than blades, and in time, even the holiest were hunted. By the early 1300s, the Templars had grown rich, owning lands, banks, and castles across Europe. Kings owed them debts, the church relied on their might, but their secrecy made them vulnerable. Whispers grew, of heresy, of hidden rites, of unholy practices behind closed doors. Whether truth or fabrication, it was enough to light the pyres. It was King Philip IV of France who struck first. Deep in debt to the order, he moved swiftly. On one grim morning in 1307, Templars across France were arrested, dragged from beds, chained, and accused of spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, and denying Christ. I remember the fear that rippled through knightly halls. If they could fall, any of us could. The trials were a mockery, torture, twisted confessions from broken mouths. Men who had fought with honor begged for mercy, not for their sins, but for their wounds. Some confessed to things they could not have understood, just to stop the pain. Others recanted and were burned alive. Justice bowed its head that year, and silence reigned. Pope Clement V, pressured by Philip, dissolved the order in 1312. The Templars were scattered, their treasures seized, their grandmaster burned in Paris as a heretic. I was there. I saw Jacques de Molay stand with dignity, flames curling around his feet. His last words cursed those who condemned him, and within a year, both king and pope were dead. Whether the Templars were guilty, we never truly knew. Some believed they held secrets too dangerous to reveal. Others said they were simply victims of greed and fear. What I know is this: they rode with courage, and they died with fire in their eyes, and their ashes darkened more than stone. They darkened trust. The scandal shook the world. No knight could look upon his title the same way. We who had once sworn oaths before altars now questioned who truly held power. The sword was not enough. The church could destroy as easily as it blessed. And in the quiet after the flames, a new fear was born. So when you hear of the Templars, do not think only of mystery or myth. Think of men betrayed by the very hands they once served. Their downfall was not just the end of an order, it was a warning carved in smoke and blood. Even the holiest armor can be pierced by envy. Once to be knighted was the end of a long, hard road. Years of service, trials of body and soul. But as kingdoms grew and kings sought control, the blade that once judged became a stamp of favor. Lords knighted men not for valor, but for loyalty, for coin, for convenience. The ceremony remained solemn, but the meaning changed. Titles became tools, handed out like tokens. I watched squires barely trained rise to knighthood overnight, their fathers wealthy or well-connected. No bruises marked their skin, no scars shaped their hands. Yet they wore the same spurs as those who had bled for years. It stung, less from envy than sorrow. The craft we honored was now currency. Kings used knighthood to bind followers, granting titles to secure borders or reward flatterers. In wartime, whole hosts were dubbed before the march, men untested, names inflated. The field became crowded with those who had never felt the weight of real battle. Some learned quickly, others did not survive their first charge. Favoritism bloomed in court. A whisper, a gift, a timely alliance could turn a merchant's son into a knight of standing. I remember one who gained his spurs after gifting a hawk to the queen. He died months later in a minor skirmish, crying for a mother who thought him noble. The world had made him a knight, but not a warrior. Honor was harder to measure now. Some among us held to the old ways, remembering the code, the silence, the pain. But more and more, we saw young lords use the title to command without wisdom. They wore fine armor and gave loud speeches, but in war, they hesitated or broke, and men died for it. In time, knighthood lost some of its weight. The people no longer looked to us with the same reverence. We were still respected, yes, but the line between knight and noble, between soldier and lord, blurred. It was no longer what you did, but who gave you the title, and that shift carved deep cracks in our world. I do not begrudge every man raised quickly. Some proved themselves, even shamed us who had doubted. But the foundation had shifted. The path was no longer walked, it was purchased, granted, politicized. And once a thing is used for gain, it is seldom recovered whole. So if you think knighthood was always sacred, forged by valor alone, think again. It became a currency in the hands of power, a symbol bent to serve kings more than causes. And those of us who remembered its weight, we carried it all the heavier, knowing what it once meant, and what it had become. The sword did not make a man noble, his actions did. And when a knight betrayed his vows, the fall was steep and merciless. I've seen men stripped of their spurs in front of weeping wives, their names erased from rolls, their banners torn down. Dishonor was worse than death, for it did not end life, it unmade it. You lived on, but without name, without place, without pride. Cowardice in battle was one path to ruin. If a knight fled when others stood firm, the shame followed him to every feast, every hall. Even a moment's hesitation could brand you forever. I knew one who turned away during a siege, his fear plain for all to see. He lived, but no one would ride beside him again. His silence became his shroud. Treachery cut deeper still. To break an oath, to betray a lord or comrade, was to invite exile or execution. I once stood witness to a knight who sold secrets for coin. They tore his crest from his cloak, broke his sword in two, and turned him out barefoot. He wandered the roads until he disappeared, likely into a ditch, forgotten. There were other sins too. Striking a priest, dishonoring a lady, attacking without just cause. These stained a knight's name beyond repair. One of our own drank too deep, struck his host, and was flogged before the castle gates. The villagers watched in silence, the children confused. He had once been their protector. Now he was their warning. Restoring honor was nearly impossible. Pilgrimage, penance, and years of service might cleanse a stain, but few were ever truly forgiven. The stain lingered, whispered through generations. Even a man's sons might suffer for it. I remember one who fought bravely, yet no lord would take him. His father had fled a battle decades before. Some chose to die rather than face shame. I've seen knights fall on their swords or ride into hopeless fights seeking a clean death. Better to be remembered with pity than contempt. We spoke of them with hushed voices, unsure if they were brave or broken, but none of us judged them too harshly. We understood. The church could forgive sins of the soul, but not the sins of a knight's oath. Oaths were sacred in our world, spoken aloud, sworn before steel and sky. To break one was to unravel the trust that bound men together. It was not only personal, it was public, a wound carved into the world around you. So if you think knights lived above consequence, remember how fragile honor truly was. It was earned slowly, lost quickly, and carried like a blade with no sheath. And when it broke, there was no balm, only the long cold exile from the world we once called ours. Steel may have been our shield, but faith and fear guided many of our steps. We saw omens in birds, in dreams, in the way the wind blew through the chapel doors. A broken sword before battle was a curse. A raven circling above meant death was near. These signs held weight, often more than a priest's counsel or a lord's command. Astrologers were sought before campaigns. I once served a baron who delayed an attack because the stars were in opposition. He paid a monk with silver to chart his fate in the heavens. When the stars finally aligned, we rode and lost half our men. Still, he blamed not the stars, but the enemy's sorcery. Reason was a fragile thing. Relics were carried into war, kissed before battle, prayed over as if they held the power of gods. A bone from a saint, a splinter of the true cross. These were said to protect from harm. I wore a small reliquary once, a gift from a dying priest. It did not stop the blade that split my shoulder, but I kept it anyway. Not all belief is rational. Knights avoided certain trees, certain paths, even certain inns rumoured to bring misfortune. I recall one who refused to pass beneath an archway where a hanged man had once swung. He rode a full day out of his way. We laughed, but when he fell weeks later from a freak storm, the laughter died. No one joked about fate after that. Witchcraft was feared, though most of us had never seen what it truly meant. Midwives and wise women were watched carefully. A cow's sudden death, a failed crop, or a knight's sudden fever, all could be blamed on hidden curses. I've seen women dragged before lords, accused with no proof beyond fear. Some were burned, some vanished. Truth mattered little. Blessings were placed on blades, on banners, on babies. We lived in a world soaked in mystery where the line between sacred and cursed was thin. A knight might recite a prayer 3 times before mounting, or sleep with a charm beneath his pillow. It comforted us, gave us order in a world of chaos. And in war, comfort is a powerful thing. Not all superstition came from fear. Some of it brought hope. A rainbow after battle meant protection from above. A dream of white horses meant triumph. We shared these things like stories by the fire, half believed but wholly felt. They reminded us we were not alone, that some force watched, even if unseen. So understand, though we carried weapons and oaths, we were still men, vulnerable, uncertain, reaching for meaning in a perilous world. Superstition was not weakness. It was a thread we clung to when all else frayed. In darkness, even the faintest light becomes sacred, and we followed it, however strange its shape. There was no gentle end for most of us. A knight did not simply hang up his sword and grow roses in the spring. When our strength waned, we became burdens, too slow for war, too proud for servitude, and too scarred to forget. The halls that once echoed our names grew silent, and many of us faded like smoke, unmarked and unmissed. Some knights were granted small estates or pensions, but these were rare and usually reserved for those with favour or family wealth. Most lived out their final years in debt or in the cold corners of forgotten manors. I knew one who begged outside the same chapel where he had once been honoured. The priest gave him bread, but not recognition. He died with frost on his beard. Others turned to monasteries, trading sword for scripture. The rhythm of prayer replaced the rhythm of hoofbeats. I tried it once, for a season, but the silence brought memories too loud to bear. The walls were thick, but not thick enough to muffle regret. I left before winter, preferring loneliness under stars to penance under stone. Some took to wandering, seeking peace in the road, hoping to forget what they had done and lost. They were called grey knights, old men with faded cloaks and empty purses. Villagers sometimes offered food out of pity. Children pointed and whispered. Their legends were gone, and only their limp remained. I passed many, and sometimes I saw myself in them. There were those who trained young squires, trying to pass on what the world had nearly forgotten, but even that was bitter at times. The new knights rode differently, spoke with sharper tongues, knew less of cold marches and more of courtly games. We taught them, yes, but with heavy hearts. They did not know what it cost to wear the title. A few grew bitter. I watched one sell his sword to lesser men, protecting merchants and tacksmen who once looked down on him. He drank more than he ate, his words slurred with shame. When he died, there was no feast, no banner, no bell, just silence and a grave dug by strangers. Not every night ends as a tale. We told ourselves we would be remembered, that our scars meant something. But time has no loyalty. Lords change, lands change, and memory is short. I rode for a banner once known across 5 counties. Now, not even the castle remains, and with it, my purpose fell into ruin. So know this, knighthood was not a path to ease or honour in the end. It was a fire that burned bright, then left only ash, and those of us who walked it to its edge found little glory waiting, only echoes and the long, cold quiet of being forgotten. Not all of us died proud. Some lived long enough to feel the weight of their deeds press upon their chests like stone. I've seen knights who once laughed in battle grow silent with age, eyes dimmed not by time, but by memory. The cries of the dying, the smoke over ruined villages, the faces of children, these do not fade. They return, night after night, unbidden. I recall one who gave up his land, his name, and took the cloth, retreating into a monastery in the mountains. He never spoke of the wars he'd fought, but his hands trembled at every sound. I met him years later, his hair white, his gaze distant. I served lords, he said, but never truth. Then he wept, as only old warriors can. Others wandered, seeking forgiveness they never truly found. They made pilgrimages to holy sites, limping through foreign lands, clutching relics and reciting prayers. I joined one once, hoping the road would lighten what I carried. But at journey's end, my soul felt heavier, not lighter. Some wounds, it seems, are not meant to heal. There were those who tried to make amends. I knew a knight who returned to a village he had once helped destroy, offering his gold and labour. They accepted neither. He slept in a stable nearby until he died, his grave unmarked. Redemption is not always granted, no matter how deeply it is sought. We were taught to serve, to obey, to strike without question. But age brings questions the sword cannot answer. Why did I ride that day? Why did I not speak when I saw wrong? In youth, we call it loyalty. In age, we wonder if it was cowardice. Regret sharpens with time, until it cuts deeper than any blade. Some found peace in the faces of children, or the hands of a kind stranger. I knew a knight who spent his last years teaching letters to peasants, saying it was the first good thing he'd ever done. He died with ink on his fingers instead of blood. A small thing, perhaps, but to him, it was enough. But not all found peace. Many died with clenched jaws, tormented by ghosts no priest could banish. Their dreams were battles, their prayers, apologies. I saw one man speak only names before death, names of the men he'd killed, the women he couldn't save, the friends he had left behind. We held his hand, but nothing reached him. So if you think all knights met their end with pride and fanfare, think again. Some of us carried sorrow deeper than our scars. We fought for banners, for kings, for causes that faded like mist. And in the stillness of our final days, we asked what it was all for. And sometimes we heard no answer at all. The songs speak of roses and secret glances, of knights who wrote poems and pledged their hearts beneath moonlight. But those were tales crafted for courts, not fields. Most of us had no time for sonnets, only for service, survival, and steel. The sword left little space for softness, and fewer still knew how to carry both love and armor without breaking beneath them. Marriage, as you know, was often arranged, an alliance more than a union. And though some grew to care for their wives, many did not. I rode beside men who could face 20 foes, but could not look their wives in the eye. Love was a luxury, unpredictable and unprofitable. We were trained to suppress feeling, not nurture it. There were trysts, of course, fleeting, secret, sometimes desperate. A lady's favour tied to a lance, a kiss stolen behind chapel walls, but rarely more than that. Duty called us away too often. And when we returned, we were changed, hardened, quieter, colder. Whatever warmth we once offered had been left on blood-soaked ground. Some knights kept mistresses, finding in them the tenderness they could not find at home. Others sought comfort in brothels or drink. It was not affection they craved, but forgetfulness, an hour without orders, guilt, or memory. I knew one who returned from crusade and wept in the arms of a woman whose name he never asked. He didn't want to know. He just wanted not to feel. Courtly love, as the poets described it, was an illusion. A knight kneeling before a lady, swearing to fight for her honor, may have never spoken more than 10 words to her. These gestures were public, performative, a way to prove refinement, not to express real devotion. Behind closed doors, the distance remained, and yet there were exceptions. I once met a knight who carried a letter from his wife into every battle. When he died, it was found folded over his heart, stained with blood, but still legible. Such love existed, but it was rare and often fragile. The world made it hard for tenderness to grow where duty and danger were constant. For those of us without family or estate, love was even further removed. We lived on the road, slept beside fire and stone, our hearts wrapped in silence. We may have longed, yes, but longing is not the same as living. And the deeper we rode into war, the further that part of us receded. So when you hear the ballads, let them sing, but know that behind them stood real men, most of whom never danced, never wrote verse, never confessed love under the stars. We served lords, not hearts. And whatever romance we might have dreamed, if we dreamed at all, was often left unwritten, unsaid, undone. We did not see the end coming, not all at once. It crept in like fog at dawn, slow and quiet, until the world we knew was changed. Gunpowder spoke louder than steel. A single shot could do what a dozen arrows could not. Pierce armor, shatter pride, and render centuries of warfare obsolete. The night, once feared and revered, began to vanish. I remember the first time I heard cannon fire. It shook the earth, split walls we once thought unbreakable. Castles fell in days, not months. No siege ladders, no heroic charges, just smoke, thunder, and ruin. The sword in my hand felt suddenly small, an artifact of a fading time. Our age was slipping through our fingers. Kings no longer needed us as they once did. Standing armies, paid, trained, and loyal to crown alone, took our place. War became a craft of formations and fire, not honor and hand-to-hand. The rituals of knighthood, the dubbing, the vigil, the oath, became ceremony without purpose. Some clung to the old ways. Most simply faded into memory. The young no longer dreamed of spurs and tournaments. They dreamed of muskets and medals. Our stories, once passed in hushed admiration, grew distant, like songs from another land. The armor we once cherished was hung in halls, polished for guests. The halls themselves became museums. Our names, footnotes. Some knights turned to politics, to courtly roles, hoping to keep influence alive. Others withdrew, unable to find purpose in a world that no longer called for their kind. I knew one who burned his armor in the woods and walked away barefoot. He said the world had outgrown him. I think he was right. And yet, the myth remained. Poets wrote of us long after we were gone, romantic, noble, unblemished. They forgot the mud, the rot, the fear. They polished our legacy until it gleamed too brightly to be true. We became symbols, not men. Our truth buried beneath legend. But I remember the bruises, the oaths, the betrayals, the quiet acts of courage that no minstrel ever sang. I remember the cold mornings, the warm hands of a comrade, the heavy weight of duty. I do not regret what I was, but I do not pretend it was what the stories claim. So when you hear of knights, think not only of banners and ballads. Think of the silence that came after the last charge, the smoke that lingered, the sword left unclaimed in the mud. That was our end, not with trumpet, but with fading footsteps, and a world that no longer turned toward us. Thank you, traveler. If ever you wish to sit again by this fire, I will be here. The embers still burn, and the night still listens. Until then, ride with courage, sleep with peace. And remember the truth behind the tales. Not all glory gleams, but every scar has its story. Good night.